Hey there, dreamers. Welcome back to our channel. Before we drift into the classic journey of Baljeet Tjinder from Phineas and Ferb, I would love to know, where in the world are you watching from tonight? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see how far and wide our sleepy little community reaches. All right, lights low, blankets up. Let's begin. Some boys dream of building rockets, others chase baseballs in backyards or imagine themselves slaying dragons. But Baljeet Tjinder, he dreamed of getting straight A's. In his world, numbers whispered comfort and equations stitched together a map of safety and sense. Everything made more sense when it could be calculated, measured, and earned. Long before he walked into the backyards of Danville with his clipboard in hand and his ever-worried voice ready to interject, Baljeet was a small boy with very big expectations. His earliest memories weren't of lullabies or bedtime stories, but of charts on the fridge and multiplication tables sung like songs. Learning wasn't just encouraged in his home, it was revered. Books lined every shelf, and his parents, wise and loving in their own unique way, celebrated his every academic milestone like others might celebrate a soccer goal or a spelling bee win. He was proud of his mind, and he had every reason to be. Baljeet could solve advanced math problems before he lost his first baby tooth. He memorized entire science encyclopedias for fun, and once spent an entire summer constructing a homemade telescope using only cardboard and recycled glass. But even in the joy of learning, there lingered a quiet hum of anxiety, because in his world, excellence wasn't a pleasant surprise, it was the expectation. Perfection, to Baljeet, wasn't optional. It was the only road he saw. At school, teachers adored him. He always sat in the front row, pencil sharpened twice, notebook open to a perfectly symmetrical margin. He raised his hand before answering, always cited his sources, and treated group projects like doctoral theses. To his classmates, he was the brain reliable, intense, and maybe a bit too tightly wound. They didn't tease him cruelly, not often, but he did sometimes feel like he was living life slightly outside of theirs. While others ran wild at recess, Baljeet could be found reviewing flashcards beneath the shade of a tree, muttering formulas under his breath. There was comfort in control, in measuring everything, even his feelings. When something made him sad, he would chart how long the feeling lasted and when it faded. When he was happy, he would document what caused it and attempt to recreate it later. Emotions, while strange and occasionally overwhelming, felt like puzzles he could one day decode. But deep down, something quietly tugged at him. Something that couldn't be measured. A question, soft and sleepy, that he never dared to say aloud. What if I'm more than my grades? That question lingered, hovering just outside the lines of his perfectly ruled notebook. It wasn't until he met Phineas and Ferb that the question began to grow. They were unlike anyone he had ever known. Reckless with imagination, fearless in the face of failure. They didn't check answers twice. They built roller coasters before breakfast. To Baljeet, it was chaotic, unpredictable, unthinkable, and yet oddly fascinating. At first, he watched from a distance, horrified as they used banana peels as fuel or created portals to Mars. But slowly, inevitably, he was drawn in, not just by their inventions, but by the way they treated mistakes not as shameful disasters, but as steps in a dance. They laughed when things went wrong. They tried again. No one demanded perfection. In their world, fun wasn't extra credit. It was the assignment. It shook Baljeet's entire foundation. And yet, even as he started spending more time with them, clipboard in hand and voice full of hesitant warnings, he couldn't let go of his old habits. He measured every blueprint, double-checked every trajectory. He wanted so badly to be useful to prove that he belonged in their world, even if he didn't always understand it. Phineas never made him feel small. Ferb nodded at his suggestions with quiet approval, and even Isabella smiled at him kindly. But still, in the soft corners of his mind, Baljeet kept wondering, would they still like me if I weren't the smart one? If I didn't know all the answers? Despite the calm smile he wore in public and the carefully organized notes he carried, Baljeet's world was not always peaceful inside. In fact, it was often loud, not with sound, but with thoughts. Constant, endless thoughts. Did I study enough? Did I miss a question? What if I get one wrong and they all think I'm slipping? Even when surrounded by friends, even when he should have been relaxing, a small calculator-like voice hummed in the back of his mind, analyzing, evaluating, checking for errors in his own existence. This made summer in Danville a very strange experience. While most kids saw it as freedom, Baljeet often saw it as a test with no instructions. No syllabus, no grades, just a blank page, and it terrified him. And then came Buford. Ah, yes, Buford, the so-called bully. The kid who often towered over others with rolled-up sleeves, loud pinions, and fists that seemed ready for anything. Baljeet and Buford should never have gotten along. On paper, they were opposites. Oil and water, brain and brawn. But real life rarely follows formulas. Their friendship, if you could call it that in the early days, started with name-calling, chase scenes, and an occasional shove, but there was never malice in Buford's eyes, mischief maybe, curiosity often, but never true cruelty. Over time, something unusual grew between them, a balance. Baljeet would complain about Buford's lack of academic discipline. Buford would grumble about Baljeet's endless worrying, but they never left each other behind. Not once. It was as though, somehow, deep inside their opposite natures, they understood something the others didn't. Buford, in his own gruff way, saw how hard Baljeet worked, and perhaps even admired it. And Baljeet, under his frustrated sighs, respected Buford's unshakable confidence. Their arguments became traditions. Their squabbles became inside jokes. Buford once declared himself Baljeet's bully of record, which, in his own odd way, was probably the most loyal friendship contract he could imagine. Still, for Baljeet, these new friendships with Phineas, Ferb, Buford, Isabella brought both warmth and worry. He felt safe with them, but he also felt seen. And being seen, truly seen, meant they might notice the cracks. The nights were hardest. When the world grew quiet and the sky turned deep blue, Baljeet would often stare at his ceiling, hands folded on his chest, eyes wide open. There were no tests to study for at night, no experiments to supervise, just silence. And in that silence he would wonder, what if I fail? What if one day I'm not enough? He would think of his parents kind but proud, of teachers who expected the best, of classmates who only seemed to like him because he was useful. And sometimes, yes, he would even think of Buford. Would Buford still hang around if Baljeet suddenly lost every math skill? Would Phineas still invite him to help? It wasn't insecurity in the loud, dramatic way. It was quiet, like a whisper carried on the wind. The kind of fear that slips into your heart when no one's looking. So he did what he always did. He made a chart. He drew out a graph labeled Baljeet's value on the vertical axis and academic performance on the horizontal. And as he drew, he noticed something odd. The line never dipped, he never let it. But he realized, for the first time, that the line shouldn't have to exist at all. Why did his value need to be measured? And that question, left unanswered, lingered with him as he slowly closed his notebook, turned over in bed, and finally drifted off to sleep. A boy full of numbers, a heart full of questions, and a summer full of stories yet to unfold. The morning sun always found its way gently into Baljeet's room. Even the light, he noticed, had patterns, shifting through the curtains at the same time every day, dancing quietly on the walls like polite visitors. He once charted that too, of course. How long it stayed, the angle at which it entered, the warmth it brought to his desk. Everything in Baljeet's life had a spreadsheet, even things that didn't ask for one. But this summer was changing something. Gently, gradually, like the tide washing away chalk on a sidewalk. Spending time with Phineas and Ferb was like entering a realm where boundaries didn't exist. They didn't care about being the best. They didn't even care about being right. Their eyes lit up not when they succeeded, but when they tried. One lazy afternoon, they decided to build a beach in the backyard. A full beach, with sand, waves, a working tide, and even a dolphin or two. Baljeet, predictably, arrived with the calculations in hand. Waves of this magnitude could cause considerable backyard erosion, he warned, not to mention the irregularities in freshwater salinity. But before he could finish, Ferb handed him a coconut with a straw, and Phineas tossed him a pair of sunglasses. "No blueprints today, Baljeet," Phineas smiled. "Just sunscreen and relaxation." Baljeet stood there awkwardly for a moment. He looked at the coconut like it was a math test in disguise. He adjusted his glasses, glanced down at his notes, then back up at the artificial sun lamp they had suspended from a crane. Something inside him, something small but brave, whispered, "Sit." So he did. Slowly, hesitantly. But he did. And to his surprise, the sand felt nice beneath his toes. The fake waves were just soft enough to be soothing. He even caught himself smiling once or twice. Not because he had solved something, not because he had impressed anyone, but just because it felt good. For the first time in a long time, he let a moment exist without explaining it. Later that day, Buford cannonballed into the makeshift ocean, splashing everyone. Baljeet yelped, half angry, half laughing, water dripping from his carefully styled hair. Buford, grinning, floated by on an inflatable shark and said, "Relax, Nerdstein. You won't melt." And Baljeet, still dripping, surprised himself by replying, "You're right. But if I do melt, I expect a proper funeral. With charts." Everyone laughed. That night, as the sand dried off his skin and he sat on his porch alone, Baljeet felt something unfamiliar kind of calm. He hadn't been perfect that day. He hadn't corrected every misstep. He hadn't even written down half the things he usually would. But he had fun. And that fun, he realized, couldn't be graphed. It couldn't be broken into columns or ratios. It was something new, unmeasured, messy, wonderful. Still, it was a hard thing to hold on to. The moment he returned home, the smell of sharpened pencils and clean paper pulled him back into routine. His desk waited patiently, his textbooks stacked neatly like guards keeping watch. He stared at them a long time before opening a blank page. Not to do homework, not to analyze anything. Just to draw. A beach, a coconut, Buford on a shark. Smiling stick figures, a wobbly sun. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't symmetrical. But it made him feel something warm. Maybe, he thought, just maybe, there was more to him than grades, more than calculations and formulas. Maybe being Baljeet could mean many things, and not all of them needed to be measured. A few days later, Baljeet found himself alone in the park, a notebook balanced on his knees, pencil in hand. Around him, kids were flying kites, dogs were chasing frisbees, and a few parents lounged under trees, lazily reading books that flapped gently in the wind. Normally, Baljeet would have kept his head down, furiously scribbling away, some new formula, some new idea, something to prepare him for an academic year still weeks away. But not today. Today, the page in front of him was blank. And for once, that didn't scare him. He sat there quietly, watching the clouds drift above like soft boats across the sky. He wondered, in a quiet part of his mind, what it must be like to be a cloud. No expectations, no tests, no wrong answers. Just floating, soft and aimless and still beautiful. He took a breath, a deep, slow one, the kind that fills your chest in a way that feels like peace. He didn't know what he was supposed to be doing in that moment, and it was okay. He wasn't falling behind. He wasn't disappointing anyone. He was just being. That night, Baljeet sat at his window, knees hugged to his chest, eyes cast upward towards the stars. He used to love naming the constellations, Orion, Cassiopeia, Ursa Major. He still did. But now he tried something new. He looked at the stars, and instead of identifying them, he just looked. He let their light wash over him like a story that didn't need to be read, just felt. Sometimes he realized knowledge could live peacefully beside wonder. You didn't always have to choose. The next day, Phineas invited him over for a synchronized trampoline orchestra. Baljeet, of course, calculated the physics of trampoline acoustics within 10 minutes. But then he closed his notebook, put it down, and joined in the fun. He still wore his neatly ironed shirt, still triple-checked his bounce angles. But he laughed louder, jumped higher, let go more freely. Because even if he was the boy who measured everything, he was slowly becoming the boy who knew when not to. And maybe that was the greatest equation of all. Baljeet, intelligence, heart. Courage to be imperfect. That night, as he lay tucked into bed, the sounds of the summer night floated through his open window. Crickets sang their quiet songs, and the breeze rustled the pages of his open sketch pad on the desk. He had drawn another picture. This one was a little messier. The lines weren't straight. The coloring went past the edges. But it was perfect. He turned over, pulled the blanket up to his chin, and closed his eyes with a small smile. Tomorrow would bring another experiment, another idea. But for tonight, he needed no answers, just dreams. And so the boy who once measured everything finally let the world go unmeasured, just long enough to fall gently asleep. Baljeet Tjinder had always been told he was smart. Long before he understood what that word really meant, it was placed like a crown on his head, shiny, weighty, and impossible to ignore. Such a clever boy. Top of the class again, Baljeet? You'll be a great scientist one day. The compliments were kind, sincere, even well-meaning, but over time they began to sound less like praise and more like rules. Silent rules etched in invisible ink. A blueprint for who he was allowed to be. He never minded at first. After all, excelling came naturally. Numbers felt like loyal friends. Equations didn't judge. In a world full of chaos and uncertainty, school was predictable, safe, control. But what no one told Baljeet was that when you're always at the top, there's only one direction. People expect you to go higher. And when the only thing you've ever been known for is being smart, the fear of slipping, even just a little, feels unbearable. It began subtly. A slight fumble during a quiz, a second-place ribbon instead of first, an unexpected B on a group project where someone else forgot their part. And just like that, the whisper began inside his head. You're slipping. You're not who they think you are. You're not enough. Baljeet didn't know when the pressure stopped being a motivator and started becoming a weight. But one day it was just there, resting quietly on his shoulders like a heavy backpack full of unseen bricks. He started staying up later, rechecking answers, then checking them again. His friends would laugh and head to the arcade, and Baljeet would say he couldn't make it. Important studying, he'd say. But really he was sitting at home, doing the same problem 3 different ways to make sure he hadn't made a mistake. He couldn't explain the anxiety. Not really. To most people, he was still Baljeet, the overachiever, the smart kid, the walking calculator with a bit too much caffeine in his system. No one suspected how loud it got inside his head, especially during summer. School, with all its structure and calendars, at least gave him deadlines, rubrics, checklists. Summer was wild, untamed. There were no assignments, no test dates, no grades to chase. And that should have been freeing. But to Baljeet, it was suffocating. Because if there's nothing to measure, how do you prove your worth? So he started inventing his own challenges. He'd wake up early, write mock tests for himself, and set a timer. He'd invent personal development quizzes and assign himself reading goals for entire textbooks. He once tried to teach himself 3 languages in 2 weeks. Not because he wanted to, but because it felt wrong to just sit still. Even fun things had to be earned. He wouldn't play video games until he'd finished 5 chapters of an advanced chemistry book. Wouldn't allow himself dessert unless he solved a calculus proof. It was as if he had become both student and teacher, disciplinarian and dreamer. Always trying to outdo himself, even when no one was watching. But someone was watching. Buford. At first, Buford didn't say anything. He just showed up like he always did, throwing shade, cracking jokes, and pretending to trip Baljeet with a rolled-up beach towel. But every now and then, when the others weren't around, he'd glance at Baljeet a little longer, noticing the dark circles, the twitch in his eyebrow when something was off, the way his voice cracked when he apologized for getting a question only half right. One day after Baljeet completely broke down over a single wrong answer in a game of science trivia showdown, Buford said something uncharacteristically soft. "Dude, you gotta chill. It's just a game." Baljeet tried to laugh it off. For you, maybe. But for me, for you too," Buford interrupted, less teasing this time. "You think we like you because you ace everything? Newsflash, we like you even when you mess stuff up." Baljeet froze. It felt like something had cracked, quietly, gently, but undeniably. He wanted to believe it. Oh, how he wanted to. But years of being told that his worth came from scores and achievements were not so easily silenced. That night, Baljeet stared at a blank worksheet. He had given himself an impossible task, an advanced application challenge he had made up just hours before. There was no due date, no reason, just a self-imposed burden. He looked at the page for a long time. Then he closed it. For the first time in a long while, he closed the book and didn't finish the assignment. It wasn't a grand moment. There was no music playing, no applause, just silence. And in that silence, something new began to bloom. A tiny seed of acceptance. Baljeet thought closing that notebook would make everything easier. And for a short while it did. There was a strange sense of power in it, saying no to the little voice in his head that demanded perfection. But like all deeply rooted habits, the calm didn't last forever. A day later, that voice crept back in, asking, "What if you fall behind? What if you lose your edge? What if someone else gets ahead of you?" Baljeet had never considered himself competitive, not in the traditional way. He didn't crave trophies or public applause, but he did crave assurance. The kind that came from being needed, praised, recognized for something objective, something provable. His intelligence had always been that thing. It was the one part of himself that felt unshakable. So when that began to falter, even just a little, the panic that followed was deep and quiet. Not the kind that screams, but the kind that lingers in your chest like a shadow. No matter how brightly the sun shines outside, it remains. It was during this time that the others noticed Baljeet becoming different. He wasn't exactly distant. He still showed up to their summer projects, still offered statistics, still raised a cautious eyebrow whenever Phineas suggested building a spaceship in the garage. But there was a hesitation in his laughter, a slowness in his steps, like a boy moving through water still present, but weighed down by something invisible. Phineas, always cheerful but remarkably perceptive, tried to lighten things up. One morning he and Ferb built a Stress Vaporizer 6000, a strange but whimsical machine that turned personal worries into pink cotton candy clouds. All you had to do was speak your stress into a microphone, and the machine would translate it into sugary puffs of sweetness. Isabella confessed her worry that the Fireside Girls might outgrow their troop. Buford grumbled about being underestimated in dodgeball, and when it was Baljeet's turn, he paused. His hand hovered over the microphone, but no words came. Because how do you explain a kind of pressure that has no beginning? A kind of fear that isn't about one moment, but every moment. Instead, he smiled politely and said, "Oh, I'm fine, just fine," and he stepped back. The machine gave a disappointing whir and released a puff of stale air. That evening, Baljeet sat on his porch again, watching the sky change colors, pink to orange, orange to purple. He always loved sunsets that reminded him of gradients in art class, soft transitions, predictable beauty. But tonight he didn't feel calm. Instead, he felt restless, like he was chasing something but didn't know what. He tried reading. That didn't help. He tried organizing his science flashcards. That only made him more aware of the two topics he hadn't reviewed lately. He even tried listening to calming music, but the tempo felt off, and he found himself adjusting the EQ settings obsessively. Eventually, he just sat there, quiet, motionless. And that's when the memory returned, a distant moment from when he was much younger. A school competition, national-level math league. He had studied for months, carried notebooks with him everywhere, ate lunch alone so he could practice problems. And when the results were announced, he came in second. His parents were kind about it, supportive even. "Second place is still incredible," they said. But Baljeet didn't remember their words. He remembered the pause, that tiny flicker in their eyes, that almost invisible moment of surprise. And to a small, brilliant boy who had wrapped his identity around achievement, that pause said everything. We expected more. And from that day on, Baljeet never forgot. He learned that love might be unconditional, but pride had rules. So here he was, years later, still trying to earn that proud look. From his family, his teachers, even his friends, maybe. And worst of all, from himself. Because when you grow up being told you're gifted, failure doesn't feel like a mistake. It feels like betrayal. That night, unable to sleep, Baljeet pulled out an old journal. Not the kind he used for test scores or scientific observations. This one was hidden behind his bookshelf, a worn notebook with a soft blue cover filled with pages that had nothing to do with school. On one page, he had sketched his dream garden. On another, a made-up superhero with a telescope cape and a voice that could read stars. In the back, there was a list of things he wanted to do someday. Bake a chocolate cake from scratch. Watch the sunrise from a mountaintop. Learn guitar. Tell Buford he's a good friend, but only once. Do something not for a grade. Baljeet stared at the list for a long time. Some items made him smile. Others made him ache. Because even these small, gentle dreams felt distant now, like stars flickering on the edge of a sky too full of clouds. He wanted to reach for them. But reaching meant loosening his grip on the one thing he thought kept him grounded: perfection. And letting go even just a little still scared him more than he cared to admit. At school, Baljeet's world moved with clinical precision. Timetables were sacrosanct, expectations were sky-high, and every little action had a consequence. Even the chalkboard became a battlefield where mistakes weren't allowed to exist for longer than a second. Most kids would be mildly annoyed at a wrong answer. Baljeet, though, would freeze, heart-pounding, face flushed. One error could unravel the entire carefully constructed image he had of himself. After all, who was Baljeet if he wasn't the smartest kid in class? His identity had become so entwined with his intelligence that even the smallest academic stumble felt like a personal collapse. An A- wasn't just a grade. It was a whisper that maybe he wasn't enough. Maybe the version of himself that people praised so often was built on fragile ground. In these moments, Baljeet didn't just worry about failing a test. He worried about failing as a person. At home, the pressure didn't disappear. It simply changed its shape. Supportive as his family might have been, there was always that silent nod of expectation. Education was valued deeply. Being smart was a gift, and wasting that gift was not an option. So Baljeet pushed himself harder, staying up late into the night, surrounded by glowing equations and quiet sighs. He didn't rebel, didn't resist, didn't even pause to ask what he wanted. And there wasn't time for that. There were competitions coming up, assignments to polish, concepts to master, and trophies still to be won. There was no villain here, just the weight of hopes, both internal and external, pressing down on a young boy who had never learned how to be anything less than exceptional. Sometimes, in the solitude of his room, Baljeet would imagine a different version of himself, one where he wasn't worried about calculus scores or science fairs, a boy who didn't clench his jaw every time a new test was announced. Maybe that Baljeet was out on a skateboard, or building wild inventions with Phineas and Ferb without overthinking the laws of physics. Maybe that version of him didn't feel the gnawing fear of being replaced or forgotten if he wasn't the smartest in the room. But fantasies were fleeting, and the real world called him back with every ring of the school bell. And then there was Buford. To anyone on the outside, Buford was the last person you'd expect Baljeet to spend time with. Loud, impulsive, messy, everything Baljeet wasn't. Their relationship began like a cartoonish parody of a bully and victim dynamic. But over time, the walls started to crumble, and what emerged was a bizarre but oddly functional form of balance. Buford didn't care about grades or gold stars. He lived moment to moment, confident and comfortable in his chaos. And while he might never say it out loud, he liked Baljeet, more than he liked most people, in fact. Baljeet, for his part, was perplexed by Buford. The very idea of living without structure seemed terrifying, and yet he found himself strangely drawn to it. There was freedom in Buford's carefree energy, in his unfiltered emotions and refusal to dwell on mistakes. He wasn't perfect, but he didn't pretend to be either. And maybe, just maybe, Baljeet wanted a little of that for himself. Their friendship didn't solve Baljeet's internal struggles, but it did something just as valuable. It gave him space. With Buford, he wasn't just a GPA or a science whiz. He could yell, laugh, or groan without needing to explain himself. He could fail a silly bet or lose a game and still be accepted. It was a quiet kind of healing, not flashy, not immediate, but real. Still, the pressure never truly left. It hovered in the background like static, even on the best days. At school events, Baljeet would feel his throat tighten just before his name was called. Applause always followed, but it felt hollow sometimes, like they were clapping for the idea of him, the smart one, not for the boy who sometimes just wanted to draw comics or sing out of key or take a nap on a summer afternoon. And that's the thing about being under pressure. It doesn't always crack you right away. Sometimes it shapes you so slowly and so silently that you don't notice it until you're much older. Looking back, wondering why you were always so tired even when you were supposed to be doing well, Baljeet carried all that day after day. But inside him was something quietly strong, a resilience born not from rebellion or bravado, but from determination. He didn't give up. He didn't break, even when it felt like he might. And in that quiet perseverance, there was a kind of heroism rarely acknowledged in shows like his. 'Cause sometimes the bravest thing a kid can do is keep trying. There was one summer day, bright and blazing, when Phineas and Ferb had built a mind-boggling contraption designed to simulate alternate timelines. Naturally, Baljeet had insisted on doing multiple diagnostic checks, analyzing safety protocols, and calculating margin errors before stepping in. But something different happened that afternoon. Maybe it was the way Buford nudged him forward with a crooked grin, or the way Isabella casually shrugged and said, "Come on, Baljeet, you think too much." Whatever it was, he let go. Just a little. And inside that simulator, he saw a version of himself that never had to be perfect. A boy who still loved science but didn't let it define him. A boy who made mistakes, tripped over his own equations, and laughed about it. That Baljeet had friends who didn't care how many awards he had. They liked him, not just his answers. When the simulation ended, Baljeet didn't speak right away. He stared at the ground, letting that vision settle in the corners of his mind. Maybe he couldn't have that world. Not exactly. But maybe he could take a piece of it with him. He started making small changes. He let himself lose an argument without replaying it in his head for days. He gave Buford a genuine thank you the next time the bigger boy stuck up for him, even if it was in his usual gruff way. He stopped rewriting his lab notes 20 times to make them perfect, and once, just once, he turned in a project without adding bonus material that no one asked for. It felt strange at first, wrong even, like walking without shoes. But slowly, the world didn't fall apart when he stopped chasing perfection at every turn. The sky didn't crumble, and his friends didn't vanish. Life kept moving, maybe even a little lighter than before. Baljeet was still brilliant, of course. That part of him would never go away. But now it wasn't a shield or a burden. It was just part of who he was, like his love of Bollywood musicals, or the way he tapped his pencil when deep in thought, or how he always knew the difference between meteors and meteorites. Pressure didn't define him anymore. Not entirely. And over time, he learned how to talk about it, in small, hesitant words. In quiet conversations where he'd mutter, I don't want to mess everything up. And someone, maybe Ferb, maybe Isabella, maybe even Buford, would respond with a simple truth. You won't. And even if he didn't believe it right away, it helped. Those words became like stepping stones, guiding him out of the maze of self-doubt. One evening, Baljeet sat on his rooftop, eyes tracing the stars. The world was quiet, with only the chirp of crickets and distant laughter from the neighborhood. He felt the weight of the sky above him, not as pressure, but as wonder. So vast, so full of questions, so patient. For once, he didn't feel the need to have all the answers. He leaned back, hands behind his head, and allowed himself to just be. Not as the best student, not as the boy with the perfect score, but as Baljeet, genuine, earnest, trying and learning every day how to be okay with who he was. Because even a brain under pressure deserves peace. There's a certain kind of friendship that doesn't make sense on paper. A pairing that defies logic, background, and every social cue we expect. And yet when we see it in motion, it somehow just works. For Baljeet Tjinder, that friendship was with none other than Buford Van Stam, the self-proclaimed bully of the neighborhood, with a soft spot for fish and a surprising moral code. It all began, as many of their stories do, with a challenge. Baljeet, meticulous and principled, was determined to complete a math assignment ahead of schedule. Buford, meanwhile, was playing with a remote-controlled tank and minding his own chaotic business. Their paths collided when Buford, bored and looking for someone to pester, declared himself Baljeet's designated bully. Baljeet was horrified. A bully? Assigned specifically to him? It sounded like a nightmare, and at first, it kind of was. Buford would snatch Baljeet's lunch, ruffle his carefully combed hair, and interrupt his every attempt at academic focus. But over time, a curious thing happened. The bullying took on a strangely affectionate tone. Buford never crossed certain lines. He never humiliated Baljeet in front of others. He never actually hurt him. And when anyone else tried to mess with Baljeet, Buford would suddenly show up, arms crossed and fists clenched, growling, "Hey, that's my nerd." Possessive? Yes. Oddly protective? Also yes. To the outside world, it was bizarre. But to those who paid closer attention, it was something deeper, something real. Because behind the pushing and name-calling, there was a quiet loyalty. Buford never let Baljeet down when it counted. And for Baljeet, that was everything. He'd spent so much of his life feeling like he had to earn affection through good grades, perfect conduct, and achievements lined up like trophies on a mental shelf. But Buford didn't care about any of that. He didn't care how many awards Baljeet won or how clean his handwriting was. He liked Baljeet just because, sure, he still called him names, but when the chips were down, when Baljeet was anxious, overwhelmed, or in trouble, Buford showed up. Not with speeches, not with understanding words, but with presence, with action, with loyalty. There was the time Baljeet panicked over a failing grade, one grade out of a dozen, and convinced himself his academic career was over. Buford, entirely unconvinced, marched into the school, stormed the teacher's office, and demanded a regrade. He even brought cupcakes as a bribe, homemade, though badly burned. The teacher didn't change the grade, but Baljeet couldn't stop laughing when he heard about the cupcake assault. "Don't worry, nerd," Buford had muttered, tossing frosting-covered pan into the trash. "Next time I'll add sprinkles." Then there was the summer water balloon contest when teams were formed randomly and Baljeet ended up stranded on the opposing side. Buford, after 10 seconds of lobbing balloons at everyone else, suddenly paused, looked at Baljeet getting pelted by 5 kids, and defected mid-game. "I'm with the nerd," he announced, shielding Baljeet behind a trash can and launching a full-scale counterattack. "I didn't even ask for your help," Baljeet said later. Buford just shrugged. Didn't have to. Their friendship wasn't clean or calm. It was rough around the edges, full of teasing and bickering and moments where they seemed like polar opposites. But buried in all that noise was trust. The kind of trust that forms when two people show up for each other again and again, even when they don't say the right things or know the perfect way to help. Baljeet had to adjust to it. He wasn't used to this kind of loyalty. He'd always relied on structure and formality, where everything was earned and graded. Buford didn't play by those rules. His support came unexpectedly, like a punchline or a prank. But it was real, and slowly, Baljeet began to rely on it. Their dynamic may have started as an unlikely pairing, but over time, Baljeet realized something surprising. Buford listened. Not in the way teacher or parent might, but in the way only a friend who's paying close attention can. He remembered the details Baljeet tried to bury, like how Baljeet always tapped his pencil when he was nervous, or how he avoided looking people in the eye when he didn't know the answer. One afternoon, when the group was building an elaborate time-traveling roller coaster, Baljeet grew quiet. He kept rereading his calculations, scratching them out, starting again as the others hammered away around him. Buford noticed. Without making a big deal of it, he casually dropped a can of soda by Baljeet's foot, muttered, "Drink something before your brain melts," and sat beside him, not saying anything, just being there. It was simple, but in that moment it meant more than Baljeet could express. Not everyone saw the soft edges in Buford. To most, he was the brash, loud-mouthed kid with a reputation. But Baljeet had learned to read between the lines. He saw how Buford always left the last slice of pizza untouched, just in case someone wanted it later. He saw how he'd pretend to nap when things got emotional, only to quietly hand over tissue when someone started crying. And most of all, he saw how Buford had a quiet radar for when Baljeet was slipping into the darker corners of his own mind. It wasn't perfect. Buford didn't always know what to say. He'd deflect with sarcasm or goofiness, sometimes making things messier before they got better. But he tried. And Baljeet, who had always been surrounded by people expecting perfection, treasured that effort more than he let on. Their adventures together were often chaotic, like the time they got accidentally stranded on an inflatable raft in the middle of Lake Nose, bickering the entire time. Baljeet had brought a waterproof notebook in case we need to calculate survival ratios, while Buford had packed 2 fistfuls of beef jerky and a slingshot. They argued for hours. Buford teased. Baljeet fumed. But when night fell and the lake grew quiet, Buford noticed Baljeet shivering and, without a word, draped his own jacket over him. It smelled like hot dogs and lake water, but it was warm and comforting. The next morning, when they were finally rescued by Ferb's hover drone, Baljeet returned the jacket and Buford just grinned and said, "No charge, but next time, bring a heater instead of a notebook." It was never grand gestures or perfectly scripted moments. It was the in-between stuff, the loyalty that lingered behind the sarcasm, the way Buford always showed up, rough, clumsy, but consistent. Baljeet, who had once been wary of Buford's presence, now found that he looked for him in the room, that he felt a strange relief when he heard that familiar, gravelly voice, even if it was shouting "nerd" across the park. Because now, that word didn't sting. It had become something else entirely. It was almost affectionate. Their friendship challenged Baljeet, forced him out of his comfort zone, taught him that life wasn't always about clean lines and perfect outcomes, that sometimes connection was forged not through flawless execution, but through messy, imperfect, unspoken care. Buford was loud, chaotic, and absolutely unpredictable. But he was also dependable, surprisingly kind, and, though he'd never admit it, loyal to the core. And for a boy like Baljeet, who had always measured relationships in earned approval and polite expectations, this kind of raw, unfiltered friendship was something rare, something real. He didn't say it often, maybe not even aloud. But in his own quiet way, Baljeet had come to realize something simple, something true. He was grateful for Buford. even if Buford would just laugh and say, "You're welcome, dork." There was a day Baljeet always remembered, not because it was dramatic or filled with flying contraptions, but because it showed him the quiet depth of their friendship. It was during one of the rare summer days when the others were busy. Phineas and Ferb were away visiting their grandparents. Isabella had a fireside girls' retreat, and Candace was too busy with her own plans to monitor the boys. Baljeet found himself at the park alone, sitting under the same tree he and Buford often took over during their daily adventures. He was reading, as usual, but found it hard to concentrate. The breeze was gentle, but it didn't bring the usual peace. The laughter of kids playing nearby felt distant, muffled. It wasn't that he was sad, just off. Then a shadow loomed over his book, and a familiar voice said, "What? No plans to get kidnapped by space monkeys today?" Baljeet blinked up to see Buford standing there, hands in his pockets, a scuffed football tucked under one arm. "I thought you were with the others," Baljeet asked. "Was. Got bored. Figured the nerd might be lonely." Baljeet chuckled softly and shifted to make space beside him. Buford didn't sit right away. He tossed the ball into the air a few times, caught it with one hand, then finally plopped down beside Baljeet with a grunt. They didn't talk much after that. The silence wasn't awkward. It was the kind you only share with someone who knows you well. They sat together, watching the clouds move above them. At one point, Buford handed over a piece of gum without looking. Baljeet took it silently. The small gestures carried more weight than entire conversations. And then, after a long while, Buford muttered, "You ever feel like you gotta be smart all the time? Like if you mess up once, everyone's gonna notice?" Baljeet turned to him, surprised by the question. It wasn't often Buford asked things like that. "Yes," he said quietly. "All the time." Buford nodded, chewing slowly. "Yeah, that's dumb." Baljeet smiled. "It is." It was a rare moment of real vulnerability from Buford, one Baljeet knew better than to draw attention to. Instead, he responded with a quiet understanding. It was enough. That day lingered in Baljeet's memory because it reminded him that their friendship wasn't built on shared interests or common personality traits. It was built on showing up, on listening when it mattered, on accepting each other fully, quirks, flaws, and all. Later that summer, during another backyard invention gone wrong, Buford ended up stuck in a tangle of rubber bands from a malfunctioning catapult. While Ferb worked on freeing him and Phineas delivered a lively monologue about elastic propulsion potential, it was Baljeet who finally leaned over, pulled the bands aside, and deadpanned, "Next time, maybe don't volunteer to test launch yourself." Buford grinned, rubber bands sticking out of his hair. "Nah, that's what makes it fun." Baljeet rolled his eyes but couldn't help smiling. There was a rhythm to their chaos now, an understanding built on hundreds of weird moments and strange inventions. Somehow it worked. And somewhere along the way, Buford stopped being a puzzle Baljeet couldn't solve. He wasn't a problem to be analyzed or a variable to control. He was just Buford. And in a summer full of questions, Baljeet was always trying to answer. It was comforting to have something he didn't have to explain. Buford didn't always say the right thing. He didn't always act with grace or precision. But he had a way of cutting through the noise of Baljeet's thoughts and anchoring him to the present. Whether it was through a well-timed insult, a joke only they would understand, or just an unspoken offer to sit and be quiet together, Buford was there. And for Baljeet, who had always tried to do everything right, who measured his worth in correct answers and extra credit, it was a gift to be around someone who saw him beyond the grades and expectations. Someone who, in his own clumsy, loyal way, said, You're good enough as you are. The more summers that passed, the more Baljeet and Buford found themselves drifting into a rhythm that no one else quite understood. At school, their dynamic was chalked up to an odd friendship, one part rivalry, one part strange alliance. But in the warm quiet of Danville's long, adventurous days, they were simply two boys figuring out life side by side. One of the final summer projects Phineas dreamed up was a giant inflatable water labyrinth. Massive, twisting, constantly moving, and entirely unpredictable. Baljeet was hesitant at first. There were too many variables, too many moving parts. He liked neat calculations, firm outcomes. Buford, of course, signed up immediately. What's the worst that could happen? We drown? Cool. But when Baljeet stood at the entrance of the water maze, clutching his homemade waterproof clipboard, panic buzzed at the edge of his thoughts. Buford noticed it instantly. You don't gotta do it if you don't wanna, he said surprisingly soft. Ain't gonna think less of you? Baljeet blinked at him. You won't? Buford shrugged. You already annoy me enough. That's not gonna change. The simplicity of that statement, crude, awkward, honest, settled Baljeet's nerves more than any formula could. So he went in. And yes, he got lost. And yes, his notes got soaked. And at one point, he screamed louder than was necessary when a water cannon triggered unexpectedly. But somewhere in that chaos, he laughed. Really laughed. The kind that made your stomach hurt. And when he finally burst out of the exit, soaking wet and still holding the soggy remains of his clipboard, Buford was waiting. About time, nerd. Baljeet raised the dripping clipboard in mock triumph. I took the scientific route. Yeah? And it still took you 20 minutes longer than me. They both laughed. And that was Buford's way. He never let Baljeet spiral too far into seriousness. He didn't pull him out with pep talks or lectures. He did it by simply existing, loudly, clumsily, and absolutely unapologetically. And it was a relief. As they sat on the curb eating popsicles later that afternoon, Baljeet asked, Do you ever think about what'll happen after summer ends, when we all grow up? Buford squinted into the sun. Nope. Baljeet smiled. You should. Statistically, most childhood friendships, nerd. Right? Sorry. Buford nudged him with his elbow. We'll be fine. You'll be some famous brainiac. I'll probably run a hot dog stand. And I'll still make fun of you every time you sneeze like a kitten. Baljeet laughed again, this time quieter. That sounds nice. And he meant it. Because when you're someone who lives inside your head, it's rare to find someone who drags you out into the world again and again without judgment. Someone who lets you be the full version of yourself, even the messy, uncertain parts. Buford wasn't just a friend. He was a grounding force, a reminder that life didn't always have to be earned through achievements. Sometimes it could be enjoyed in the messy, unmeasured moments between them. And for Baljeet, that realization was perhaps the most freeing of all. As the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long over the Danville sidewalk, the two of them sat in companionable silence, popsicles melting down their hands, not needing to say anything more. Because in that moment, there was nothing left to prove. Just a boy and his unlikely best friend, watching the world slow down together. Baljeet had always trusted numbers. In a world full of chaos, unpredictability, and emotions that often made no logical sense, equations gave him something to hold on to. Numbers didn't lie. They didn't change based on mood or memory. They were fixed, eternal, dependable. So when the summer turned strange, When he began to feel something in his chest that formulas couldn't quantify, Baljeet's first instinct was to run calculations. Was it a shift in air pressure? A result of poor sleep cycles? A side effect of emotional fatigue brought on by too much time spent with Buford? But the more he tried to analyze it, the more confused he became, because the fluttering in his stomach didn't follow a neat trajectory. The tightness in his chest when things didn't go as planned couldn't be graphed. He found himself staring at his equations longer, his mind drifting off mid-problem. Even Isabella noticed. "You've been kind of spacey lately," she said one morning as they all gathered around the blueprint table. "Everything okay?" "Yes, statistically, yes. There's an 83% chance that all factors are within normal range." She blinked. "Baljeet, that didn't answer my question." He forced a smile. "I'm fine. Just recalibrating." But he wasn't, because no matter how hard he tried to apply logic, his world felt off balance. Something was shifting beneath his feet, and the numbers, for once, weren't helping. The turning point came on a quiet Wednesday when Phineas, Ferb, and the rest of the group were working on a reverse gravity playground. It was the kind of chaotic, brilliant invention Baljeet would normally love, but this time he lingered at the edges, clipboard in hand, eyes distracted. Buford floated past him upside down, arms folded across his chest like a loaf of bread. "You coming in, or what?" Baljeet hesitated. "I'm recalculating the angle of atmospheric distortion." Buford rolled his eyes. "You mean you're scared?" "I am cautious." "Same thing, nerd." Buford flipped himself around and dropped beside him, startling a puff of dust from the grass. "You used to jump into this stuff without blinking. What's your deal lately?" Baljeet frowned, staring at his clipboard. "I think I'm overwhelmed." Buford tilted his head. "By what?" "You already aced summer." "That's just it," Baljeet whispered, fingers tightening around the clipboard. "Every summer I've had a goal, a project, a purpose. But lately, I find myself doing things without knowing why. I feel things that make no logical sense. I'm scared. I'm broken." Buford's brow furrowed. "You ain't broken, dude. You're just growing up." Baljeet looked at him. "But why doesn't anyone talk about how confusing it is?" Buford shrugged. "'Cause it's confusing for everybody." That answer, simple and vague as it was, stuck with Baljeet for the rest of the day, and the next, and the one after. Because the truth was, he had built his world around the idea that everything could be explained, that hard work equaled success, that preparation meant safety, that numbers could solve every riddle. But now he was facing problems that had no clear variables, emotions that didn't follow rules, relationships that couldn't be reduced to a chart. One afternoon he sat alone in the park with a notebook in his lap. Instead of equations, he began listing feelings, not analyzing them, just naming them. Frustration, loneliness, uncertainty, curiosity, hope. It was harder than he thought, but freeing. For the first time, he wasn't trying to fix himself, he was just observing. And in that quiet, he realized something important. Sometimes the numbers didn't help because the problem wasn't meant to be solved, it was meant to be felt. Baljeet's quiet exploration of emotions wasn't something he shared openly, not at first. After all, what would his friends think if he told them that he, the boy who prided himself on winning math competitions and solving triple integral problems before breakfast, couldn't explain the way he was feeling inside? But even without saying a word, his friends seemed to notice. Phineas started giving him more space during projects, gently nudging him into parts of the invention that involved quieter, more methodical thinking. Ferb, as usual, didn't say anything at all, but he'd often sit beside Baljeet while they worked, his calm silence saying, "You don't have to talk. I'm just here." Buford noticed, too, in his own unique way. One evening after their backyard experiment of launching sandwiches into orbit, a surprisingly successful mission, Buford caught Baljeet lingering behind while the others laughed under the stars. "You thinking again?" Buford asked. Not unkindly. Baljeet nodded. "I'm trying not to, actually. It's hard." Buford smirked. "You ever tried punching a pillow?" Baljeet looked confused. "No, should I?" "It's dumb, but it kind of helps," Buford said, flopping down on the lawn beside him. "Not because it solves anything, just because it gets the stuff out of your head for a minute." Baljeet smiled softly. Buford's advice rarely came wrapped in wisdom, but sometimes it hit closer to truth than any textbook. In the days that followed, Baljeet kept experimenting, not with blueprints, but with balance. He started leaving some of his worksheets unfinished. He joined Isabella and the Fireside Girls for a hike, even though he had no checklist to optimize the trail. He laughed when Buford dumped a bucket of popcorn on his head during movie night. It wasn't part of any plan, but it made him feel real. One rainy afternoon, Baljeet was at home organizing his bookshelf in alphabetical and thematic order when his mom walked in. She watched him for a moment before saying gently, "Beta, it's okay not to be perfect all the time." Baljeet looked up. "But I like being precise." "I know. It's one of the things I love about you, but sometimes being precise becomes a shield." She reached over and touched his shoulder. "It's okay to not have all the answers. That's not failure, that's life." Those words stuck with him. It made him reflect on one of the most stressful moments of his summer, a moment he'd tried to forget. It was during the Tri-State Academic Showdown, an intense scholastic competition that Baljeet had trained for all year. He had memorized formulas, practiced speeches, and even rehearsed mindfulness exercises to stay calm. But on the day of the competition, something unexpected happened. As he stood behind the podium, ready to answer a complex theoretical physics question, his mind blanked. For the first time in his life, the numbers weren't there. They vanished, like birds fleeing a storm. He stammered, blinked at the crowd, and finally admitted, "I don't know." He could still remember the way the silence felt, heavy and wide. He could still feel the tightening in his chest, the heat rising to his face. And he remembered thinking, "This is it. This is the end of everything I've worked for." But it wasn't. The judges moved on. The world kept turning. And though he didn't win first place that day, his friends still clapped for him when he walked off stage. Buford even tackled him in a bear hug and shouted, "You still beat 26 other nerds." And maybe that moment, more than any other, taught him the value of failure. Not because it hurt, but because he survived it. He started writing about that in his notebook, too. Not just numbers or feelings now, but stories. Short little entries about things that made him uncomfortable, or sad, or proud. He called it his inexact log, a diary of moments he couldn't define but didn't want to forget. And as he flipped through its pages one night, lit only by the soft glow of a lava lamp in his room, Baljeet felt something lift inside him, like a pressure valve gently releasing. It was one of those slow summer evenings, warm and golden, the kind where the sun hangs on a little longer than expected. Baljeet was sprawled on a picnic blanket in the park, notebook in hand, staring up at the clouds and sketching out silly shapes in the margins. It was not a homework assignment. It wasn't a scheduled task. And that in itself made it feel thrilling. Nearby, Phineas and Ferb were building a solar-powered popcorn launcher, something about perfecting kernel trajectory, and the others were laughing, chasing each other through spurts of popcorn rain. But Baljeet stayed back, quietly enjoying the sight. He had been learning to step away when he needed space, to just observe. Not every moment had to be measured. Some just had to be felt. And feelings, he had discovered, weren't so easily organized. There were days when everything still felt too heavy, like when he accidentally got a B on a practice exam and spiraled into an afternoon of pacing and self-doubt, or when someone casually joked about him being like the smart one who doesn't know how to have fun, and it stung more than he wanted to admit. But he was learning not to bury those moments under worksheets and equations. Instead, he started writing little letters to himself, simple, kind things like, "You're more than your grade. It's okay to be different. You can feel lost and still be moving forward." He kept them tucked into books, taped behind shelves, even scribbled on the back of his closet door. Tiny reminders that even when the world felt overwhelming, he didn't have to be perfect to be worthy. They just laughed, argued over the best soda flavor, and lit a controlled mini firework that only mildly singed the grass. Later that night, as Baljeet sat by his window, sipping the last of his drink and watching the stars blink overhead, he realized something important. Buford might not have known the exact reason he came over, but he knew enough to show up. And that was the kind of friendship Baljeet hadn't known he needed until he had it. Even the stars above, so mathematically perfect in their patterns, had to burn and explode and collapse to create something new. Maybe he could allow himself that same chaos, that same grace. The next day, when Isabella asked him to help choreograph a Fireside Girls dance routine for their summer showcase, Baljeet said yes. Not because he had a plan, not because he thought he was good at dancing, but because it sounded fun. Wild, unpredictable fun. And he laughed the entire time, even when he tripped over his own feet and accidentally invented a move they dubbed the falling parabola. It didn't go into any notebook. He didn't record it, chart it, or file it into his folders. It was just a memory, messy, spontaneous, real. That summer, Baljeet learned that the world wouldn't fall apart if he let go of control for a moment. That sometimes, when the numbers didn't help, what did was something far softer. Friendship, silliness, and learning to laugh at himself. The boy who once measured everything was beginning to measure a little less. And strangely, he felt more himself than ever. Baljeet was no longer trying to outrun his brain. He had started learning to walk alongside it, hand in hand, like an uneasy truce between the analytical and the emotional. The numbers didn't vanish. They just stopped being the only language he understood. Life had other codes, too, unwritten, unquantifiable, but just as powerful. One quiet afternoon, the group gathered at the Flynn Fletcher yard for what Phineas called a do-nothing day. No blueprints, no world-altering projects, just swings, snacks, and conversation. Baljeet brought a book, of course, but left it unopened on his lap for most of the day. He watched as Candace lay on the grass, humming to herself. Buford tried balancing a grape on his nose, and Ferb tuned a ukulele with exacting precision. "Hey, Baljeet," Phineas said from beside the tree. "You look peaceful." The words caught him off guard. Peaceful wasn't something he'd ever been called. Focused, yes. Precise, of course. But peaceful? That was new. "I suppose I am," he replied, blinking at the thought. In truth, he had been feeling lighter, not because life had grown easier, but because he had stopped treating every small mistake as a sign of impending doom. He still had goals. He still wanted straight A's and academic recognition. But he also wanted laughter, and late-night stargazing, and time to make mistakes without self-punishment. At some point that summer, Baljeet had even started journaling. Not equations or study notes, but feelings. His pages were messy, scattered, sometimes illegible. But they were his, honest and unfiltered. And in those scribbles, he found clarity that no formula could give him. One entry, written on a particularly stormy evening, simply said, "Today I cried because I felt like I wasn't enough. Buford brought me a sandwich and didn't ask why. I think that's what kindness looks like." It was a far cry from the version of himself who believed vulnerability was a weakness. Now he wore his heart a little closer to the surface. Not wide open, but not sealed off either. He had learned that pressure didn't just come from tests and grades. It could come from within. And facing that kind of pressure required something stronger than intellect. It required courage. One evening, as summer drew closer to its end, Baljeet stood on the roof of Phineas's house with the others, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery pinks and oranges. His feet dangled off the ledge, legs swinging softly in the breeze. No one said much. They didn't need to. There was something sacred in that quiet, a mutual understanding that they'd made memories here that couldn't be graphed or explained. "You know," Baljeet said softly, "this might be the best summer I've ever had." Buford nudged him with his shoulder, grinning. "Told you all that nerd stuff was slowing you down." Baljeet rolled his eyes but smiled. "It wasn't the math. It was how much I let it define me." Below them, the town shimmered under the fading light. It wasn't perfect. There were still anxieties waiting for Baljeet on the other side of summer. Tests, expectations, the fear of failure. But something inside him had shifted. He had discovered a strange kind of freedom in admitting that he didn't have all the answers. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most brilliant equation of all: heart friendship, perfection, niece. As the stars blinked into view, Baljeet leaned back against the warm shingles of the roof, surrounded by the quiet presence of friends who had become family. The boy who once measured everything had begun to understand the value of things that couldn't be measured at all. Baljeet had always held on tightly, to order, to numbers, to the rhythm of structured thought. He gripped his goals like lifelines, afraid that if he let go, he might fall into chaos, into being average, unnoticed, unremarkable. But there came a day, quite unlike any other in his summer, when Baljeet discovered what it truly meant to let go. It began like most summer days in Danville: clear skies, warm sunlight, and the kind of breeze that promised mischief. Phineas and Ferb had announced a spontaneous trip to the clouds, quite literally. They had designed floating lawn chairs that would drift on helium-powered currents. Baljeet was skeptical, of course. He ran the calculations 3 times and noted the flaws in their lift ratio. "And if the wind shifts above 300 feet, we could end up in Canada," he warned. "Sounds like an adventure." Phineas grinned. Buford clapped a hand on Baljeet's back. "Don't worry, Brainiac, I'll hold you down." That image, Buford acting as an anchor, was somehow both reassuring and terrifying. Still, Baljeet joined them. Part of him always would. Not because he was reckless, but because something deep inside him trusted that despite all his fears, these days with his friends mattered more than any data point ever could. They lifted off slowly, chairs bobbing like bubbles in the wind. Baljeet's chair wobbled slightly, and he gripped the armrests with white knuckles. The ground grew smaller beneath him, rooftops shrinking to colorful Lego bricks, the town sprawling like a diorama. "I don't like this," Baljeet muttered. "I really don't like this." "Look around," Isabella called from a few feet away, her ponytail fluttering like a flag. "Isn't it beautiful?" Baljeet looked, and it was. The sky stretched endlessly, soft clouds floating like dreams you could almost touch. The horizon bent slightly with the curve of the earth, a reminder of just how vast the world was beyond Danville, beyond school, beyond exams. It was in that moment, suspended between earth and sky, that something shifted. Baljeet's grip loosened just a little. He took a deep breath. The air up here felt different, lighter somehow, cleaner. For a boy who lived by charts and metrics, it was the first time he allowed wonder to take the lead. That night, after they safely landed without being blown into Canada, thankfully, Baljeet returned home and stood at his bedroom window for a long time. His books lay stacked neatly on his desk. A framed certificate of excellence hung beside a perfectly drawn periodic table. But now the room felt heavier than it used to. He walked to his desk, pulled out a notebook, and stared at the blank page. Instead of equations or essays, he wrote one simple line. What if being perfect isn't the goal? The idea unsettled him. All his life, excellence had been his armor. It had been how he earned respect, attention, even friendship. Without it, who was he? The question echoed through his thoughts in the following days, amplified by something new. A letter. It arrived in the mail with a crisp envelope and a familiar letterhead. The National Young Academic Scholars Program, Baljeet's dream institution. He opened it with trembling hands. He had applied months ago, submitting essays, grades, and project work, meticulously prepared. His heart pounded. Dear Mr. Tjinder, it read, we regret to inform you. The words blurred. His stomach dropped. Rejected. He blinked, rereading it. It had to be a mistake. He had done everything right. The scores, the recommendations, the passion. He felt the room tilt slightly, as if gravity itself had shifted. Baljeet sank to the floor, the letter falling beside him like a leaf. This wasn't just about one opportunity. It was about everything he'd built himself upon. The pillars of perfection he had balanced for so long now cracked beneath him. The tears came slowly, then all at once. He didn't tell anyone, not that day. Instead he walked, alone, through the familiar streets of Danville, through parks echoing with laughter and past cafes that smelled like summer. He wandered with no destination, just motion. Eventually he found himself on the bridge overlooking the creek, the same place he'd once calculated water flow rates during a science project. Now he simply watched the current pass, unmeasured and untamed. He pulled the rejection letter from his pocket, smoothing its folds. Then, without thinking, he let it go. The paper fluttered, caught the breeze, and spiraled downward into the water. He watched it drift, carried away without resistance. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a failure. He felt free. Baljeet didn't know exactly how long he stood there, watching the current sweep away the last remnants of that letter. But something inside him had changed. Something small and quiet, like a whisper finally being heard in a noisy room. He didn't feel entirely better, not yet. But he no longer felt crushed under the weight of his own expectations. When he returned home, he didn't immediately rush to find a backup plan or revise his resume. Instead, he did something he hadn't done in what felt like years. He went out just to play. No agenda, no learning outcome. Just being part of the world without trying to calculate his place in it. Buford found him later that afternoon at the park, swinging gently back and forth. You look like someone just flushed your straight A record, he said, plopping down on the swing next to him. Baljeet didn't correct him, didn't launch into a long-winded defense. He simply nodded. Yeah, kind of feels like that. Buford tilted his head, watching him. Then after a moment, he added, You know, you don't always have to be the smart one. Baljeet blinked. What? I mean it. You could be the funny one, or the weird one, or even the one who sometimes screws stuff up, still wouldn't make you less Baljeet. It was such a simple statement, and yet it landed with the weight of something profound. Baljeet had built his identity so carefully, brick by brick, and here Buford was, tearing down the walls with just a few kind words. "I don't know how to be anything else," Baljeet admitted quietly. "Then maybe now's the time to figure it out." They didn't talk much after that. They just swung back and forth, in the soft rhythm of summer silence. Later that week, Phineas and Ferb invited everyone to build a giant floating music stage. It was part boat, part amphitheater, and entirely absurd in concept. Just the kind of thing that used to drive Baljeet crazy with its impracticality. But this time, when he looked at the plans, he didn't immediately reach for a red pen. Instead, he smiled and said, "Count me in." Buford almost dropped his wrench. "Who are you? And what did you do with the real Baljeet?" Baljeet grinned. "He's still here. He's just taking the summer off from overthinking." As they built the stage, Baljeet found himself laughing more, fretting less. He still helped with calculations when things got too risky. He wasn't reckless, after all. But he didn't let the numbers control the day. He sang along during rehearsals, off-key, nervously at first, but louder and with more confidence each time. It was a new side of him, unfamiliar but not unwelcome. And something incredible began to happen. His friends didn't like him less because he wasn't perfect. If anything, they seemed to embrace him more. Even the adults noticed. Dr. Doofenshmirtz, who happened to wander by during one of the rehearsals, watched Baljeet from the sidelines with a quizzical look. "Isn't that the overly serious boy who once sent me a 10-page letter about improper lab safety?" Baljeet overheard him and turned, smiling. "Still serious, just not scared anymore?" Doofenshmirtz blinked. "Huh, good for you." By the time the music stage launched on the lake, floating, twinkling with lights, alive with joy, Baljeet stood at the center, surrounded by friends and laughter. The water reflected their celebration like a mirror of everything they'd built together. And when the first notes rang out, Baljeet didn't think about pitch or math or whether his voice cracked. He just sang. The song echoed across the lake, drifting past cattails and sleepy frogs, over the docks and onto the backyards of unsuspecting neighbors. It wasn't a perfect performance. Phineas hit a high note that made a seagull squawk, and Ferb's guitar strings snapped mid-riff, but none of it mattered. The audience cheered with abandon, and Baljeet, shy, precise Baljeet, soaked in every bit of it. There were no grades to chase here, no formulas to solve, just the warm hum of connection, like sunlight on skin. After the show, while everyone was packing up, Isabella approached Baljeet. "You were amazing up there." Baljeet laughed sheepishly. "I was off-key." "Doesn't matter," she smiled. "You were happy. We all saw it." And that word stuck with him as he helped fold chairs and pull tangled wires from the grass. Happy. Not accomplished. Not admired, and just happy. It felt new, unfamiliar, but real. That night he walked home slowly, watching the stars blink on one by one. His backpack hung loosely over his shoulder, not crammed with the textbooks or future plans, but with a water bottle and a towel from the lake. It felt lighter. So did he. When he got home, Baljeet did something he hadn't done in years. He pulled out an empty journal. Not for notes, not for equations, just blanks off pages. He wrote one sentence on the first page. "I don't know what I want yet, and that's okay." He stared at it for a while, then smiled. It wasn't a perfect start, but it was honest. The following days were slower, easier. Baljeet still loved learning. He always would. But he no longer treated life like an exam he could fail. He gave himself permission to try things he wasn't good at. He painted with messy brushstrokes, tried skateboarding with Buford and promptly fell into a bush, watched sunsets without wondering how light refraction worked. And through it all, something beautiful happened. His confidence stopped depending on being right. He started seeing value in being present. One afternoon, Ferb invited him to help redesign a backyard roller coaster. It was wild, fast, and totally unsafe if left unchecked, which naturally meant Phineas was at the helm. "Do we have any equations for the braking curve?" Baljeet asked. Phineas grinned. "Nope, just vibes." Baljeet paused. The old him would have panicked, but the new him? He chuckled and replied, "All right, but I'm at least giving you a margin of error of plus or minus one broken mailbox." As they worked together, Baljeet realized something else. Being smart didn't mean he had to be scared. Intelligence was a gift, not a curse. It could help, guide, and protect, but it didn't have to imprison him. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the roller coaster's first test run launched, with a joyful scream, Baljeet felt something unexpected. Pride, not in the math, but in the moment. In the laughter, the friendships, the silly risks, and the freedom to just be. Later, he sat beside Buford on the lawn, their backs against a tree. "You've changed," Buford said without judgment. Baljeet glanced at him. "Is that bad?" Buford shook his head. "Nah. I like the old you, but this one, he looks like he can breathe." Baljeet looked up at the darkening sky, stars winking above. He exhaled deeply. "I think I'm finally learning how." Summer began to slow its pace. The backyard inventions weren't quite as wild. The days grew lazier, stretched long and golden under skies that seemed softer. Baljeet noticed himself changing, not in a dramatic sense, but like how a song fades into something else. Still familiar, but no longer the same. He still studied, of course. That would never truly leave him. But he no longer studied out of fear. He read because he wanted to. Because a page turned under moonlight now felt like wonder instead of pressure. One evening, Candace caught him sketching something in the grass. "Another blueprint?" Baljeet shook his head. "Just doodling. I don't know what it's going to be." Candace looked surprised. "No end goal?" He smiled. "Not this time." She sat beside him and watched the sky turn pink. "You're different these days." "I'm trying to be," he said quietly. It wasn't easy, this act of letting go. The old instincts tugged at him sometimes. Panic before a minor quiz, the urge to double-check every answer, the dread of imperfection. But now he'd catch himself and pause. Take a breath. Remember that his worth was not dependent on being flawless. He began to notice more around him. The shape of clouds, the sound of someone's laugh, the awkward beauty in Buford's attempt to bake cookies for no reason at all. These little things became his new metrics, not grades, not rankings, but moments, laughter, the ease of being loved just as he was. One day, Phineas invited everyone to a hilltop near the edge of town. No inventions, no plans, just a quiet space to watch the stars come out. As they sat in a loose circle, Baljeet leaned back into the grass. The sky stretched endlessly above him. No ceilings, no chalkboards, just stars. Buford sat beside him, munching noisily on chips. "Do you remember when you cried over getting an A-?" Buford asked, half teasing. Baljeet rolled his eyes, grinning. "I still think it was an injustice." "You were nuts back then." "I was scared," Baljeet admitted softly. "I thought if I wasn't perfect, I wouldn't matter." Buford looked at him a long time. "You matter more now, just so you know." And somehow, that meant more to Baljeet than any certificate ever had. The summer waned. The world began to tug gently back toward routine. Schools reopening, schedules returning. But Baljeet carried something different into the coming year. A memory of that hilltop, of a roller coaster built on trust instead of precision, of songs sung off-key, a friend who stood by him even when he was at his lowest. In many ways, letting go wasn't about abandoning who he was. It was about balancing it, embracing both the curious mind and the tired hearts, recognizing that sometimes the bravest thing a boy can do is simply stop chasing the impossible and enjoy what's in front of him. Baljeet's story didn't end with straight A's or a scholarship to a prestigious academy. It didn't end with a perfect summer or a neatly wrapped bow. It continued, quietly, gently, with a boy who finally gave himself permission to rest, to breathe, to be unsure, and still be whole. And as the stars blinked above and the sounds of his friends laughing filled the air, Baljeet closed his eyes and whispered to the sky, "I'm enough." The last week of summer drifted in like a feather, soft, quiet, and barely noticeable at first. The buzz that usually surrounded Danville began to settle. Like even the wildest imaginations needed a nap after such an energetic season. Projects slowed, inventions were less chaotic. The air itself seemed to hum with a sleepy sort of calm. Baljeet felt it most of all. There was no big academic deadline on the horizon, no score to top, no prize to win. And for perhaps the first time, he wasn't scrambling to fill that space with new expectations. Instead, he let the quiet linger. He walked a little slower. He didn't double-check every fact in his head before speaking. He wasn't trying to optimize or improve or maximize anything. He just was. It felt strange, but good. He found himself under a favorite old tree in the backyard, notebook resting in his lap. The pages were empty, not because he had nothing to say, but because, for once, he didn't feel like saying everything. He'd spent years filling pages with equations, ideas, schedules, dreams, all organized, all calculated. But now the blankness didn't feel intimidating. It felt free. Ferb wandered by and sat beside him. No words, just quiet presence. They listened to the chirping of summer birds, the flutter of leaves above, the gentle whirring sound of a distant invention winding down. Then Ferb glanced at him and said, "You don't have to figure everything out today." Baljeet gave a soft chuckle, not because it was funny, but because it was true. He looked down at the blank page and shrugged. "Old habits," he murmured. "It's hard to let go." Ferb nodded as if to say, "Yeah, but you're doing it." Later that day, Baljeet went for a walk. Not to think, not to solve, just to wander. He passed familiar places, a sidewalk where he once argued passionately with Buford about theoretical physics, the curb where he lost a tooth trying to ride a self-balancing scooter he'd designed. He walked past the park where Isabella once led them on a treasure hunt that turned into a musical. Each memory surfaced gently, like leaves floating to the top of a pond. At the edge of town there was a hill he hadn't visited in a long time. Nothing fancy, just grass, a few scattered trees, and a sky that stretched wider than any chalkboard ever could. He climbed to the top, the breeze brushing through his shirt, and sat down. The notebook was still with him, still blank. He opened it anyway and looked at the page. No pressure. No need to write. Just space. And up there, with the wind playing softly at his sleeves and the setting sun coloring the sky like watercolor, he let his mind drift. Not to problems or plans, but to dreams. Not fixed, logical dreams, but the kind that flowed like clouds, uncertain, beautiful, open. He imagined building something just for fun, with no rubric or rules. He imagined standing on a stage, not to win anything, but just to sing. He imagined traveling without an itinerary, laughing at things that didn't make sense, failing without falling apart, meeting people and not worrying about how they saw him. He imagined not knowing and being okay with it. He didn't need to chase certainty anymore. He could follow curiosity instead. Let his questions lead, not as a way to prove himself, but simply to explore. And somewhere in the middle of that quiet, he picked up a pencil and wrote 4 simple words in the center of the first page. Let's see what happens. Then he leaned back on the hill and watched the stars slowly begin to appear. Baljeet didn't race down the hill when he left. He walked, slowly. He listened to the grass crunch beneath his shoes. He noticed the fireflies flickering near the bushes, the soft glow of porch lights switching on around the neighborhood. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't rushing back to anything. That night he slept with the window open. He let the warm summer air drift through the curtains, carrying with it the faint sounds of the world winding down. Somewhere nearby, someone was humming. A dog barked in the distance, and Baljeet, lying under a light blanket, stared up at the ceiling fan turning overhead, not thinking about tomorrow, not running simulations in his mind, just existing. The next morning came quietly, as if it didn't want to disturb him. He woke naturally, not jolted by an alarm or shaken by a mental checklist. No formulas demanded his attention. No academic competitions loomed over the day, and somehow the lack of structure didn't frighten him the way it once would have. Instead, he stretched. Then he sat up. Then, with a sleepy smile, he reached for his notebook. The words from the night before were still there. Let's see what happens. He added nothing more. He didn't need to. They still felt true. Downstairs, his mom was making breakfast. The smell of something warm, cardamom maybe, floated through the air. Baljeet wandered into the kitchen barefoot, sat down, and just chatted. Not about school, not about progress, just about the day. His mom asked if he had plans. He said he wasn't sure. She smiled and said, "That's okay." It was so simple, so casual, and yet it struck him. All this time, he'd thought people expected him to be brilliant every moment of the day. But maybe that pressure didn't always come from outside. Maybe sometimes he'd placed it there himself. After breakfast, he called Buford. Not for a study session. Not to remind him about homework. Just to hang out. Buford didn't ask questions. He just said, "Cool, I got an extra slushy coupon. Meet you in 10. They met near the food court downtown, and for the first time in a while, Baljeet didn't feel the need to overthink the menu. He got the weirdest flavor they had. Buford got 2. They sat on the curb, legs stretched out into the sun. "You've been kind of different lately," Buford said through a mouthful of crushed ice. Baljeet raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" Buford squinted up at the sky. "Less squinty, less calculatory." Baljeet laughed. "Is that a compliment?" Buford shrugged. "I don't know. I kind of like the old you. But this one's chill, too." Baljeet looked down at his slushie. "I guess I just stopped trying to fix things that weren't broken." "Cool," Buford said, already halfway through his second cup. "Still not sharing my fries, though." They stayed like that for a while. The sun moved lazily across the sky. People passed. The town felt alive but gentle, like it was letting Baljeet catch up with it at his own pace. Later they wandered into the park. There was a little wooden bridge over a stream, and Buford kicked pebbles into the water, while Baljeet watched the ripples stretch outward. He thought about how once he would have tried to measure the depth of the stream, or calculate the speed of the ripples, or diagram the pebble's trajectory. And maybe someday he would again. But today he just liked the way the water moved. Buford glanced over at him. "You thinking science stuff?" "No," Baljeet said with a grin. "Just water stuff." Buford snorted. "Nud." Baljeet didn't disagree, but this time the word didn't sting. The sun dipped a little lower. Shadows stretched longer. They walked back slowly, shoes scuffing the dirt, not in any hurry. There was nothing waiting at home except a soft bed and a sky full of stars. Before they split off, Buford punched him gently in the arm. "You're not bad company when you're not freaking out." "I'll try to remember that," Baljeet said. "Don't try too hard." Baljeet smiled and watched his friend walk away. He thought about how much that friendship had changed, grown from something tense and strange into something warm and steady. A slow kind of love built over time, through arguments and apologies, through competition and companionship, and now trust. He looked up again, and for a second he felt like everything was exactly as it should be. A few days later, Baljeet returned to the library, not for a research marathon or to prep for a science fair, but just because he missed the place. The scent of old pages and polished floors felt familiar, like an old friend. He wandered through the aisles with no destination in mind. For once, he didn't gravitate toward the math or science sections. Instead, he found himself standing in front of a shelf labeled simply fiction. He hesitated. All his life, he'd read to learn, to gain knowledge, to get ahead. Stories without real facts or useful data always felt inefficient. But today, that didn't matter. He pulled out a book with a colorful spine, one he'd never heard of, and sat down in a quiet corner with a window seat. The light was soft. The library was almost empty. The world seemed to hush itself for him. He opened to the first page and let the story take him. The characters didn't solve problems with logic. They didn't win awards or design perfect machines. They just lived. They made mistakes. They got messy. They stumbled through things, grew through things, felt things. And Baljeet realized something startling. He liked it. He didn't need to understand every twist and turn. He didn't even mind when a plot hole popped up. He wasn't there to critique. He was there to feel. Hours passed. The shadows outside shifted. A librarian dimmed the light slightly. Baljeet didn't notice until he looked up and realized it was almost evening. He closed the book gently, holding it like something delicate, and tucked it under his arm. At the front desk, he checked it out, not just to finish it, but to keep a little piece of this moment with him. On his way out, he passed a younger kid sitting at a table, head buried in a thick math workbook, frustration scribbled across his face like graffiti. Baljeet paused. "Stuck?" he asked gently. The boy blinked up at him, surprised. "Yeah, the word problems are the worst." Baljeet leaned over and looked at the page. "Want a tip?" The boy nodded. "Try drawing the situation first," Baljeet said, sketching a quick little stick figure diagram with silly labels. "Sometimes seeing the problem makes it easier to understand." The boy stared at the drawing, then slowly smiled. "Hey, that kind of helps." Baljeet straightened, smiling back. "It's not about getting it perfect, just finding your way through." As he walked home, Baljeet thought about how strange it was. He used to feel like he had to earn every bit of wisdom he passed on. Like he wasn't allowed to help unless he was the absolute best at something. But maybe kindness didn't need credentials. Maybe you could help just because you cared. That night, the stars were especially clear. Baljeet sat at his bedroom window, a notebook open again. He jotted down things that made him curious. Nothing formal, nothing structured. Just scribbles. Why do some people love the rain and others hate it? How do friendships evolve when no one is trying to fix anyone? What does it mean to enjoy something without being good at it? He didn't need to answer them right away. Maybe he never would. But the questions felt alive, like sparks waiting to catch. The next day, he visited Phineas and Ferb. The backyard was unusually calm. No roller coasters or portals or flying machines, just a couple of hammocks, a jug of lemonade, and Perry curled up in his little chair. Phineas waved him over. "We're taking a chill day. Want in?" Baljeet dropped his backpack and sank into the third hammock. "Very much." Ferb handed him a glass of lemonade. It was slightly too tart. "Perfect." The three of them rocked gently in silence for a while. No one felt the need to fill it. The quiet between them was full of trust. Then Phineas spoke. "You know what I realized? The summer didn't feel shorter, even though we didn't build something every single day." Baljeet smiled. "Yeah, some of the best days were the quiet ones." Ferb raised his glass slightly in agreement. They talked a little. Nothing grand, just small thoughts about movies and books and weird dreams they'd had. Baljeet told them about the novel he'd started. Phineas looked shocked. "Fiction? You?" Baljeet laughed. "I know. Who am I becoming?" Phineas grinned. "Someone interesting." They all laughed. It was a light, breezy kind of laugh, the kind that didn't come from a punchline, but from comfort. As the sun began to lower again, Baljeet leaned back and closed his eyes. He felt something stir in his chest, not anxiety, not pressure, but hope. A quiet sort of wonder, the knowledge that he didn't have to be a perfect student or the smartest kid in the room to matter. He just had to keep learning, keep feeling, keep dreaming. And that he could do. A few weeks later, Baljeet stood at the edge of a small lake just outside of town, holding a paper airplane in his hand. It was a crisp, quiet morning, the kind where the world felt paused, like it was waiting for something. The water was still, reflecting the soft pink and gold of the sky above. Birds called gently in the distance, and the air was filled with the scent of grass and possibility. He unfolded the airplane and looked at what was written on the inside, a little list he'd made when the summer first began. Win academic decathlon. Build science lab in backyard. Memorize 5 new languages. Beat Ferb at chess. Have something impressive to show for every single day. He read the list once, then again. Then folded the paper back into its sharp triangle and smiled. Without a ceremony or second thought, he tossed it into the breeze. The wind caught it quickly, lifting it higher than he expected. It soared a little awkwardly, wobbling, twisting, but it kept going. Over the water, over the reeds, a splash echoed softly as it finally met the surface. Baljeet didn't chase after it. He sat on the dock and let his legs dangle over the edge, water brushing his sneakers. And in the rhythm of the ripples, he thought about everything he'd learned. Not the kind of learning that came from textbooks or tests, but the softer kind. The learning that took time. That came from messes and missteps and mornings like this one. He thought about all the expectations he used to carry like bricks in his backpack. How he used to see life as a series of checkboxes, achievements, trophies, grades. But lately things had changed. He'd learned to laugh without rehearsing the joke, to fail and not spiral, to rest without guilt. And most surprisingly of all, he'd learned to enjoy the parts of himself that weren't about being the smart one. He started painting badly. He got obsessed with bad 80s movies and started writing reviews of them for no one but himself. He played games and lost and didn't beat himself up. He learned to take naps. And more than anything, he learned to be present, fully and unapologetically. One evening near the end of the summer, the gang met up for a simple backyard campfire. No big inventions, no outrageous projects, just marshmallows, a few lawn chairs, and Perry the platypus sitting in Buford's lap like a plush toy. Candace had surprisingly good ghost stories. Isabella brought homemade s'mores kits with cute little name tags. Phineas had glow-in-the-dark bracelets for everyone. And Ferb? Ferb handed Baljeet a warm mug of cocoa without saying a word, like he just knew that's exactly what Baljeet needed in that moment. And when the stars blanketed the sky and the fire crackled low, Baljeet looked around at all the faces lit by golden light and thought, "This is enough." It wasn't a gold medal or a perfect report card or a ribbon of achievement. It was better. It was real. No metrics, no pressure. Just people who cared about each other, sharing a quiet night. Baljeet leaned back in his chair, pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders, and let himself be a part of it. Not as a performer, not as a brain on display, just as a boy, one who was still learning, still dreaming. And as the fire turned to embers and the moon rose a little higher, Baljeet whispered, more to himself than anyone else, "I think I like who I'm becoming." And for the first time, he didn't need to prove it. He simply believed it. And now, dear dreamers, as Baljeet's story winds down for tonight, we're reminded that growth isn't always loud. Sometimes it's found in quiet changes, small acts of letting go, and brave little steps toward joy. Whether you're like Baljeet, always measuring, always striving, or just learning to slow down and breathe, we hope his journey brought you comfort. If you're still awake, let us know in the comments. What was your favorite Baljeet moment from Phineas and Ferb? And as always, thank you for being part of our peaceful little corner of the internet. Wherever you are, may you sleep deeply, dream sweetly, and wake up knowing you're enough. Until next time, good night